We're recording, it's live. So welcome everyone. And on behalf of the PJSA, I'm hosting this conference session. I'm also a participant in the conference session. And in case you aren't aware, the topic is telling other people's stories, navigating narrative responsibility. And I don't know that it was presented this way in the book, but this is actually meant to be a conversational space. So we, the presenters, haven't pulled together extensively long presentations in order to provide time and space for us to all share our own contributions to this really thorny topic of navigating ethical responsibility in conflict narratives. So we're going to do a little bit of I'm going to do a little bit of framing, and then I'm going to pass it off to Lisa and Michael, who are then going to ground us in some cases in asking some of the tough questions around how we navigate this narrative responsibility that we're questioning and grappling with together. In true conference fashion, I'll apologize for the reading that I'm doing, but it is happening. Just to tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is, I should actually introduce all the speakers at this point. I'm Alison Castel, and I'm an assistant professor of rhetoric and communication at Regis College in Denver. Do you want to introduce yourself, Lisa?
Oh, sure. I'm a visiting research fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame.
And Michael?
I am the Associate Director and Primary Instructor for the Peace, Conflict, and Security Program at the University of Colorado-Boulder.
Great, thank you. And so although I'm a professor of rhetoric and communications, my background is in conflict analysis and resolution with a specialization in narrative. So my aim here is to really just give a global perspective, which actually is anchored in my own personal perspective. So that's the way it goes. And starting off with, what we might hold as obvious in this context here, where we're talking about narrative responsibility, which is that stories matter. Stories are important, they're critical, and they provide the framework around which we understand ourselves and others and how we ought to live. And this in turn has a direct effect in our approach to our lives, our behaviors, and our engagement with others in the broader society. The way that narratives operate has implications for interpersonal relationships, but also the development of local, national, international policy for what gets privileged and what gets valued in society, gravely affecting how certain bodies move through the world more freely than others. Stories are also analytic tools that connect individual experience with systemic analysis and can reveal the dynamics of power and conflict. How self and other are constructed by and within stories reveals such dynamics. However, all stories are partial, as evidenced by how they're told in conflict situations. Conflict narratives are oversimplified and characterized by extreme accounts of self and other, where the self is legitimized and considered righteous, and the other is delegitimized and evil. As conflict analysts, educators, practitioners, it's our job to work with such stories and to uncover what has been lost in the partial telling in order to avoid violence. This is a critically important task and is obviously not straightforward. So what is our responsibility as conflict resolvers, as practitioners, as educators, as researchers to the stories that we hear and tell? Is it the positionality of the teller that is most important to consider, or is it just that the story be told and examined? When we find the crux, the critical importance of the story, is it rather an imperative to tell the story no matter who we are, that it isn't a matter of whether we tell it, but how we tell it? So lately, I've been hanging on the words of Audre Lorde from an excerpt from Sister Outsiders. And it's called The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. In it, she shares that her realization that remaining silent will not protect us or save our lives, and that we have an imperative to speak out against injustice, to tell stories regardless of how we identify. And she implores, and I'll quote her, that we not hide behind the mockeries of separations that have been imposed upon us and which so often we accept as our own. For instance, I can't possibly teach Black women's writing. Their experience is so different from mine. Yet how many years have you spent teaching Plato and Shakespeare and Proust? And as I sit with this question from her, I grapple with myself. How does this imperative apply to me and to my field as a conflict scholar? Knowing that not all stories are equal, some are valued more than others, some benefit from wide visibility and legitimization while others do not. Do we have the same responsibility to all stories to engage in the labor of finding ways to tell stories seldom told or untold, that live in fear of being decimated, the ones that challenge the status quo? This is an ethical question central for conflict resolution practitioners, scholars, and educators as we consider particular sites of storytelling, whether we're doing research, whether we're in the classroom or during a mediation. How can we be attentive to the narratives that are subjugated or that are casualties of longstanding status quo master narratives that govern what is normative or considered common sense? What if we are asked to be compassionate to the master narrative? More than notions, words, or thoughts, narratives eventually become material. They allow us to see and do some things while also governing and regulating what we can see and do. We are indexed, individually we're indexed by a set of cultural stories and positioning in conflict, and we also index people in a moral space that's marginalized, and that ends up leading to the struggle for legitimization as people try to reposition themselves within those stories. So from this perspective, in conflict resolution, power lies not necessarily in certain individuals or groups that can impose their will onto others, but it lies in the discourse that shapes how we account for human nature, how we define conflicts, and how we describe peace and conflict resolution. And these discourses aren't static. They do change over time in response to world events and changing norms. So the question comes up, and how are we to be ethical as we work with stories? Is it to challenge master narratives by telling the subjugated stories without tokenizing, without stepping out of our bounds, without playing the hero, but recognizing and not shirking our responsibility? And is that responsibility equal to task as conflict resolution processes would have us believe? You know, I'm talking there about the focus on process. Some of the ethics that I'm talking about here in this sense don't only apply to putting the onus on a speaker for raising their voice against a powerful master narrative, but as conflict scholars and practitioners, we are inextricably responsible as ethical listeners to recognize our listening as partial and interpretive and hold ourselves accountable to the stories that we are hearing and subsequently sharing. So, you know, in my view, we could hold a whole conference just trying to examine some of these ethical quandaries and the associated questions that emerge depending on the context in which we're speaking. The express work, however, of narrative and conflict is to move from simple stories that delegitimize other to more complex narratives that convey a higher regard for other. So the idea is that complex narratives, the more complex the story, the more pathways that open up in order for new understandings to emerge, for new possibilities to emerge, for the material social processes that can follow to emerge. So in my work, in order to build complexity around narratives and to understand the partiality of narratives in my teaching, I teach conflict communication, storytelling for social justice, and dialogue facilitation. And in those classes, I ask students to consider why they are telling a story in the particular way that they are. What are they choosing to omit? What are they choosing to privilege? What are they choosing to include? And what language are they using and what framing are they using? And I also asked them, and we examined master narratives, and I asked them, what are the master narratives they may be feeding into or actually seeking to shift in others? In the context of field work, where I've done field work, in various places, but in Colombia and the US, I might add some questions about what am I noticing about the stories that can be told and can't be told, and why, and perhaps what stories are people trapped in that they're having, that they can't get out of. I may even add some additional questions about how the broader conflict is being framed and what ways of framing are gaining currency in the context, and why, and what ways of framing don't have any currency and why, and who's setting the terms for those kinds of conversations, and what do those framings enable or constrain. So it's a million, I know that's a lot of questions, and we're going to get at some of this more granularly, I think. As we engage in the struggle for meaning with stories, especially in conflicts that we might not be part of ourselves, how do we find our voices within the stories to tell them ethically, recognizing our own social locations and our points of view? What is our responsibility? I personally see my role as a participant in identifying the subjugated stories, the concealed stories, the hidden transcripts, and to help them rise and gain purchase and to be legitimized. However, even that is extremely tricky business. And so I give you that framing as I pass the proverbial microphone to my colleagues who come from different, or are going to come from different perspectives, grounding us in their cases. Lisa's going to talk a bit about her work with migrants, and Michael's going to talk a bit about his work as an educator of students of conflict resolution, peace and conflict studies. And the questions that they raise are going to be very different, because this is a vast topic that we're endeavoring into. And I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to let them tell their own story. And then I think, Lisa, you're going to start, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Great.
Okay, cool. All right, so my name again is Lisa McLean. I'm currently at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame, and I'm a recent graduate from the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason. I also wrote some notes because I have a tendency to kind of get off track, and there's just so much to cover here, and I wanted to cover a lot because these questions just raise so, as Alison was pointing out, this broader question of narrative responsibility takes us in so many different directions. And I'm going to be reflecting on some of the ethical dilemmas that I have right now, and I continue to grapple with as I prepare publications based off of my doctoral research. So my doctoral research project was a multi-sided ethnography analyzing the transnational activism of a group of Central American women who traveled to Mexico each year to search for their loved ones who disappeared along the migrant route. And so these women participate in an annual action called the Caravan of Central American Mothers of Disappeared Migrants. And I traveled with the caravan in 2 years, in 2017 and 2018. And visited the local collectives of relatives of disappeared migrants in Central America in the intervening months between those two caravans. So I approached my doctoral research from a feminist perspective, and from a perspective that was particularly concerned with questions of representation and the dominant discourses that circulate about migration and about migrants in the United States. In the US, the subject of Central American migration is located largely at the nexus of these competing discursive claims of crisis. Voices across the political divide seek to define the terms of the present so-called migrant crisis unfolding at the US-Mexico border, be it a crisis of national security on the one hand or a humanitarian crisis on the other. Anti-immigrant interests draw upon racist and gendered discourses of otherness and threat to position Central American migrants as representing an existential and national security threat to the United States. And so we see this most clearly in the past couple of years, and the discourses that emanate from the White House that seek to construct Central American migrants in particular as representing an invasion to the United States, or as this criminal national security threat that must be kept out. Many liberal and progressive voices, on the other hand, have sought to challenge this discourse by insisting that migrants are a vulnerable population that is in need of protection by the state. And a lot of very important investigative work has been done by journalists and by researchers to account for the violence that migrants are exposed to while in transit, as well as the conditions that have led to the ongoing exodus of Central Americans that continues to today. The portrayal of migrants as a vulnerable population in many ways serves as a much needed corrective to the sensationalistic and racist portrayals of migrants as a national security threat, and positions migrants as legible within the ever-shrinking legal framework of asylum in the United States that has shrunk even further under the Trump administration. Despite this, representations of migrants as a vulnerable population tends to erase migrants' agency and political subjectivity. And these framings of migrants as a vulnerable population are liable for co-optation by the state as a justification for the expansion of state power and control over migrants' lives, as a form of paternalistic protection, which often takes the form of the further militarization of borders, which we've seen evidence of this happening under the Obama administration, for example. This is also something that we see a lot in Europe, in European countries, justifying or framing the further militarization of borders as a needed response in order to protect migrants from making to protect migrants by convincing them not to make the journey, or deterring them not to make the journey by making the journey itself so much more difficult and deadly. So in light of this, my approach to this study was critical of how these dual discourses have been used to promote militarism, as well as how they erase or obscure migrant agency and political subjectivity. I focused my project and my research questions not solely on providing an accounting of migrants' vulnerability to harm in transit, but on the grassroots organizing of the relatives of disappeared migrants as a means to elevate a counter-hegemonic discourse of migrants and their families as political agents and as agents of transformation. These are the stories that I seek to elevate in my dissertation and the publications that come out of my dissertation. So while my dissertation or my research intentionally focused on questions of agency, I nonetheless had to engage in ethical questions around the representation of violence as the context from which these protests emerged. And it was really in this space that I felt myself having to walk multiple fine lines in terms of my choices related to narrative responsibility, or at least these are some of the questions that really rise to the surface for me when I think about these ethical dilemmas around narrative responsibility. So in a context in which migrants struggle to be legible and recognized within an ever more restrictive asylum system, narration around insecurity and the causes of displacement are also increasingly politicized. Within our field, it's widely understood that structural and direct violence are in many ways mutually reinforcing. Yet within the legal framework of asylum, or the legal framework of asylum itself, narrows the discursive landscape to speak about these variable forms of insecurity by demanding the narration of a particular kind of victimhood and vulnerability in order to be legally recognized as in need of protection. These constraints of the asylum system work in tandem with political interests that seek to paint all Central Americans as economic migrants and not as refugees. And I saw these dynamics play out during the Caravan of Mothers as testimonies of persecution by state and non-state actors were prioritized in the women's public speeches over stories that were related to displacement due to the effects of deep structural precarity. In my own interviews with families, I found that even among families whose loved ones had fled due to direct threats or experiences of violence, when I spoke with the families, they would often describe the lack of opportunities, widespread corruption, and the inability for people to see a future for themselves in their homes as the most significant problems that have led to the exodus. As I set out to write the dissertation, however, I really grappled with how to speak to the significance of structural precarity without contributing to the discourse that seeks to limit migrants' access to state protection in the form of asylum. In speaking about examples of direct violence, on the other hand, I also grappled with another set of questions around ethical representation. Many of the interlocutors I spoke with while I was conducting this research talked about their frustrations with foreign journalists and with academics who are solely interested in these salacious stories about gang violence and misery. And the repetition of these sensational stories of gang violence have had the effect of propping up the racist portrayal of Central Americans as particularly violent or criminal, lending force to the discourse pushed by anti-immigrant interests in the US. These issues led me to reflect not only on how I speak or write about the reality of violence, but also about the tendency among journalists and academics to be drawn to sensational stories of violence over the complexities of the everyday, of both insecurity and of agency. And earlier today, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say in this presentation, I read an article that reminded me a lot of these issues, as well as the encouragement that I received from activists and from some of the families that I spoke with to really seek to apprehend and reflect in my work both the insecurity that has limited life chances for so many in Central America, as well as the beauty and dignity of the place and the people. So this article was by Salvadoran journalist Roberto Lobato. It's published in the San Francisco Chronicle today. And this article reflects on, or he's reflecting in this article on Joan Didion's 1983 book about the Salvadoran Civil War. And so I'm just going to quote a couple of excerpts from the article, just because I thought it was so spot on for what I wanted to say. So he says, today when I read Didion's phrase that terror is the given of the place, the much oft quoted phrase about my parents' homeland and about Salvadorans generally, the writer in me marvels before the luminescent power of words to carry and generate new meaning from, during, and beyond the darkest of times. Sometimes, however, the electricity of words can have a Frankenstein effect, making monsters of an entire people. Sadly, Didion's writings about us forgot a foundational fact of Salvadoran life, our humanity. And later in the article, he says, Didion concluded that terror is the given of the place after spending 2 weeks in El Salvador. After spending more than 56 years among my Salvadoran friends and family, I concluded that love is also the given of the place and of the people. So these comments from Lobato and from the interlocutors that I worked with pushed me to critically examine the tensions that are at play in seeking to represent the complexities of reality, of violence and of vulnerability and of agency, particularly in a context in which these representations are highly politicized, while also being constrained by legal frameworks like asylum that demand the repetition of simple stories of victimhood. And finally, and this is where I'll conclude, I also grappled with my own positioning in seeking to represent these stories as an engaged researcher. Here, I drew a lot in the way that I approached the study and how I approached trying to write about these stories that I heard. I drew from the work of Imogen Tyler and her approach to writing about the protests of detained migrant women in the UK. Tyler explains that her aim is not to speak on behalf of the women in her article that she wrote about this one protest, or to fix the meanings of their protests, but to think with the protests in order to speak back to theory, or in this case, back to these prevailing hegemonic discourses. While I was conducting fieldwork and literally traveling and marching alongside the protests of mothers of disappeared migrants, it was far easier for me to imagine myself as thinking with the protests and not as seeking to speak for. Since leaving the field and beginning the process of writing publications and speaking at events, I've really been troubled by the slippage between these two positionings as standing, thinking, or speaking alongside those that I seek to be in solidarity with in my work, or speaking on behalf of. And this speaks, of course, to questions of reciprocity and relationship, which I also actively grapple with, but I remain really unsettled by the slippage between these positions and how we can responsibly navigate the meanings of thinking with a group of people as opposed to speaking for in our writing and in our publications. And so there's a lot more to say about all of these questions and many other questions that I haven't mentioned yet, but I think I will leave it here for the discussion and turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Lisa. Hopefully y'all can hear me. I'm battling animal competition for attention while I stare at a computer screen, which is fun. I'm just really excited for y'all to be here tonight and to be on a panel with Alison and Lisa. And I must admit that when I asked them to be on a panel on narrative responsibility, I had no idea what I meant by the term, but I really liked the idea of it. And we went from there, and we've had some really great conversations over the past few weeks trying to get ready, and it's exciting to talk about this stuff because there's, as I think Alison kind of captured in the beginning, there's a lot there, and as Lisa just made very, very real, it matters how you think about this stuff and how you put it into practice. So, you know, I'm going to work through this from the perspective, not of a researcher, but really thinking in terms of what this looks like in teaching classes, particularly conflict resolution courses. I think there's and as I kind of thought through this more and more, there's really a difference when you go to apply this concept in, say, a kind of intro to peace studies course versus a conflict resolution course. And I think that's where some of my issue comes up, is that I teach so many intro to conflict resolution courses, and I've been so kind of inspired by what narrative theory has taught us about conflict, that the more I share with it and tell students how great it is, the more doubt it casts in me about how great it is, or the more kind of quandaries it raises where I'm like, oh crap, you know, like I'm really happy people are learning this stuff. But in the same breath, oh, there's all these questions, and I really hope they don't ask me because I don't have a good answer sitting there. So hopefully y'all will help us come up with some good answers. So, you know, over the years, I've certainly become increasingly anxious about the extent to which I use other people's stories in my lessons. And so, you know, kind of the turning point isn't really an original insight, but my hang up, if I can call it that, came when I said, all right, I'm going to try to save a little bit of time, and I'm going to use somebody's kind of pre-packaged role play to teach some negotiation, right? Because who's got time to write up a negotiation role play? So I did a roommate conflict, which y'all are familiar with roommate conflicts. And of course, the scenario is that one of the roommates is a conservative bigot, everybody else in the house is a tolerant liberal, and oh, can't we just get the conservative bigot to realize they're a bigot? Right, the students, unsurprisingly, balked at having to play the bigot. None of them ever want to play the person who's going to look bad. And even when we would kind of get past the, oh, you can do this, you can step into somebody's shoes and tell their story, the performances were terrible. It was like small town backwards hick versus, you know, hip city dwelling liberals who certainly fare better in the presentation. And so, you know, I really started to get frustrated with myself, not the students, for assigning this and questioning, you know, what's the value of assigning something in which you have such simplistic representations of people, right? Because, you know, again, you don't have time to assign a whole book for somebody to prepare for a role play. But in the same breath, perhaps you could have a little bit more complexity there. And so trying to adopt some insights from narrative theory and put them into practice, I started thinking, you know, maybe I needed to write my own role play scripts, and maybe I needed to kind of adopt things that would work better in this context if I wanted to be true to narrative work. Certainly one argument could just be, you should just scratch this approach altogether and do something more engaged. And I'm in that regard, you know, I could certainly follow something more along the lines of what Alison described in terms of eliciting stories from the students to work with. And I've got some exercises where I do that. But I still believe in sadly the value of these role plays. Perhaps it's, you know, the trauma of having to go through conflict resolution programs where they do role plays with you for all of your graduate school. But I still think they're valuable. But I've also been in context in which I would call them the not so engaged pedagogy, in which, you know, the responsibility for learning in a role play is left all to the student rather than on the teacher to help make these situations actually meaningful and for you to take something from them. And so I really wanted to kind of, you know, prevent the conflict resolution as anything goes impression that I think students walk out of some courses with, especially intro courses or skill building courses that don't necessarily focus on, you know, making these techniques practical. So what this meant for my teaching, right, is I'm trying to walk this line between both saying there is some place for what we talk about as banked knowledge, you know, kind of memorization of things such as fundamental concepts and skills, while also trying to kind of do some engaged work that we can kind of tease out critical analysis and self-reflection. So I started kind of developing stories, and the challenge was, and this kind of goes back to the whole relationship that we're interested in between kind of complexity and responsibility. How do I develop complex storylines for these characters? And how do I root them in situations in which neither party can just kind of claim the moral high ground and the simulation be done? So in pulling from my own experiences, I thought it would be easier to make them actually map reality and more difficult for students to kind of dismiss outright. I also thought it would be a way of kind of democratizing access to this information, right? That students wouldn't have to produce a story in which they were the expert and then have their classmates kind of have to figure out what was going on, but rather everybody's starting from this same foundation of information. And, you know, then they could be free to be as harsh to the characters as they wanted to be in terms of their assessment. And the nice thing would be if they were being harsh and they had questions or they wanted to know why a character did something, since most of these were mistakes I have made in my life, I could tell them, right? I could say, I don't know why I did this thing. You know, at the time I thought it was brilliant, but we're recording, I'm a bleeping idiot. Right? So in that sense, right, I took really to heart this idea that narrative responsibility is intertwined with complexity. And then as a teacher, my duty was to really instill that basic insight. And so kind of following almost exactly what Alison said, right, that as people teaching conflict resolution, our job is to help folks recognize that when complexity is lost, when people are in conflict, and that loss of complexity opens the door to dehumanization and thus violence and a further entrenchment of a conflict. So in theory, good conflict work, we're going to develop the ability to sit with complexity, we're going to resist simplification, and we're going to kind of really work to do our shared humanity stuff as foundational for conflict resolution. So I was feeling good about narrative. I was feeling like I was integrating some things, and blame this panel or the turn maybe on 2020, because why not? Everything else should be blamed on it as well. But I have increasingly over the past year really run up against some of the challenges that we're interested in talking about. And one of them is that we seem to be living in a moment in which the kind of positions and situations that we want to portray that reflect what's going on in the real world, that those stories, especially the stories about the kind of multiple crises we're dealing with, are reliant on their simplicity. And the characters who we would be saying, you know, you should play in this role play, you need to play a proud boy or a white supremacist, same thing. But right, that really those characters rely on that simplicity to kind of be who they are. And as such, they're really bad stories. They're awful. But they're the stories, right? If I'm being responsible, I'm acknowledging that that's the story these folks are telling. And so, you know, in kind of looking at that, you know, I started to think more about, you know, what are we supposed to do with stories that promote and celebrate fascism or racism or sexism, economic inequality, things that are all about division? Should we try, as good kind of conflict practitioners, to help folks add depth to those stories or complexity to those bad stories? And in my experiments, this only seems to really kind of rationalize that person's or that story's intolerance and hatred of others. So it winds up turning what are really kind of clear violations of justice into misunderstandings or mistakes. And that's certainly not why I got into conflict resolution, right? I did not get in it so that somebody could tell me, and I heard this multiple times while I was back in the Midwest a few days ago, that people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor got what they deserved. And that when I asked for complexity, when I tried to dig deeper into that story, the assessment produced was an even nastier version of just full of victim blaming, right? There was nowhere for me to go in that story other than to kind of say, well, the original story sucked and the one you just told me is even worse. And I don't know how to bring you in because, gee, wow, I don't agree with any part of what you've just said to me. So rather than producing a deeper understanding of these situations, both of which in the case of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor clearly kind of rank in the realm of manslaughter, for me, narrative complexity started to run up against this kind of ethical dilemma of, you know, advancing the both siderism, that everybody's entitled to their story. So what have I been wrestling with? Well, what does the shift mean? And again, the shift for me is thinking, you know, well, is there another way to think about narrative responsibility? And I think in some ways, and this is a very freshly mixed idea, so please do not look for me to have deep penetrating insights, but this seems to be where I'm being pushed. Is this kind of move from an individual responsibility to maybe more so a collective responsibility, and that kind of against my earlier intentions, maybe the pedagogical demand, specifically in these times, is to recognize that narrative simplicity, and rather than try to fix it, maybe to encourage these bad stories. Because then we can at least label them as narratives that harm our humanity rather than advance it. And so, you know, the proposition, again, might be that to leave bad stories as they are, or maybe more aggressively, actively seek out and undermine or silence them, which is a horrible thing to kind of say if, as very intelligent people who I respect, like Sarah Cobb, define, you know, our ability to tell stories and narrate as the threshold for our humanity. Can we violate that threshold if a story itself runs against that? And so maybe, you know, we can seek to understand a bad story, but maybe it's not our job or our mission to improve on it. Maybe we let that bad story sit. What that means in the classroom, though, is less clear to me. I'm certainly still bound to encourage students to think about how a story is told, to embrace narrative complexity for tools of understanding how parties tell stories about themselves and others, and to recognize when people are telling kind of simplistic and counterproductive narratives of the other. But I've also hit a threshold in which I cannot reasonably justify presenting bad stories as legitimate or worthy of our care and attention beyond kind of recognizing that there are bad stories out there. And so the question I kind of wrote up, because we all decided we were going to toss questions at you all, was this sense of, you know, is it, what responsibility do we then have as educators to our students who tell bad stories and insist on their legitimacy? And any of you that I'm sure have taught courses over the past couple of years have had some students insist on telling some pretty god-awful stories. So yeah, I'll be quiet because we want to engage with y'all.
Okay, so this is thank you, Allison, Lisa, and Michael for your presentations. Before I open it up, it's just a little, I want to ask to the panel if anybody wants to give any initial responses to what's been said, or if you want to open it up to the group right away. So I guess it's kind of like, Allison, do you know? Lisa, do you?
I think I'm good for opening it up to the group. I think that we've put forth a bunch of questions and dilemmas that are ripe for everyone to engage with. So I'd love to hear what people have to think.
Great. So just thank you to the presenters. And, I do think that there's been a wide net cast here on which direction this can go in. And there's so many examples to draw from. And if the group has more questions than comments, then we're happy to take questions as well in order to get the ball rolling on some of this stuff. And I definitely have some responses to Michael's question, but I'm afraid that'll end up you guys watching us have a conversation. So let's start off by opening the conversation to the group and see where that goes. Can we go into gallery mode and see who wants to talk? Is that possible? So that
I think folks can switch it over themselves.
Gallery mode.
Well, oh no, there's a control where whoever's speaking is the one that's going to be on the screen. So is it possible?
I turned off the spotlight so you guys can change.
Yeah, do you mind turning off the spotlight just for a minute? We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I did. So
you did. Oh, okay, so then I just need to change my own. Great. Any thoughts, comments?
I'm happy to jump in.
But all right, Wim.
I don't like to be like the presumptuous white male who's like, let me start. and that's one of the things I was going to say as an example for part of the narrative process is that there's a way in which like there's a settler mentality of like, it's like colonizing a story, which is a different kind of metaphor than I heard you guys talking about. But yeah, that final question put me right in the grips of one of the more challenging dilemmas that I face, is that so much of my life is boring, and that like the experiences I've had, I don't feel like necessarily capture like a wide range of things, like the experience of bias and discrimination and stuff so much as the people I know. And so for the last several years, there have been autoethnographies panels at PJSA as a way of like trying to have people tell their own stories and put more of that into the discussion. And I guess 2 years ago, this is the example I really wanted to give for Dr. English's question. For the last couple of years, I've been really struggling with the singular detail of my pedagogy, which is that The best undergraduate paper I ever read or graded or worked with was from one of my students who is serving in a maximum security prison. And so part of what I like to do is encourage people who get the chance to go to jail to teach to do so, because it's been, in my experience, like the best students you'll ever have. Like they are chomping at the bit to do every bit of homework and stuff. And you're like, these are literally the best students I've ever had. But in trying to talk about this paper and the points it raises and the impact that's had on me, I've never talked about the details that make the paper most significant. In part because that would reveal the inmate's identity. And I think that could be problematic in a number of ways. And by virtue of never talking about what makes the paper so brilliant, like it ends up just being like a, oh, like when you're just bragging about teaching in jail. And so that's been the biggest ethical challenge I've had, is that like I really truly feel like sometimes you can't make the point you're wanting to make without revealing information that you may not be empowered for any number of reasons to share. It's kind of like when researchers think that they could have a breakthrough if they could only do this thing, which totally is unethical. And I think it gets back to the larger teaching part, where I think if the story forgets some of the basic principles and like our responsibility to command or generate a safe space, like maybe that's the best guiding principle that I've come up with, is that all other things aside, like safety first, and asking students to role play the part of something that's traumatizing to them might serve some teaching point. Well, it's still traumatizing to them, right? And like we just have to somehow put safety first, for better and for worse.
Does anybody want to comment on that? I'm happy to comment on anything. So y'all take the space, because I don't, I think from a narrative perspective, the idea of safety in the space is really hard for me. And there's a way, and you know, right now I'm working a lot with first year students where I'm required to create safe spaces so we can have hard conversations, and I train student dialogue facilitators so that we can create a culture on campus where dialogue and conversation aren't only happening in times of crisis, but so that we can build goodwill among each other. You know, and I don't mean to say it in a flippant way, it's just because I'm prattling about so that get through that part. But when there's bad stories out there and dominant narratives that can come into the space at any time, and not everyone's aware of how those operate and how those circulate, it's really hard to create guidelines that make because oftentimes the safety is dependent on each other respecting each other. And I guess I grapple as I train students who have very, you know, in the same way as Michael's students have a hard time stepping into a narrative that isn't their own, especially one that they disagree with. Students don't have a lot of life experience to recognize when like an American dream narrative is getting plunked into the room, or if a white supremacist narrative is getting plunked into the room. And so then how does that space from a narrative perspective become safe, unless there's some kind of inoculation happening or a direct recognition of the power that has just entered into the room, regardless of how much I understand my social location and, you know, my identity and things like that. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience, but the minute a master narrative comes into the room, there's so much obligation there. Like there's so much obligation, and leaving it, you know, that to me is then, you know, how do we create a safe space? How do we know that there's going to be the opportunity for that narrative to not get challenged and say, oh no, you can't think that way, because that wouldn't work. but to recognize how narratives move in the world and get anchored into local conversations. And that's why I have, and I'm coming from a very particular standpoint right now that isn't just as a teacher, but as this person who's promoting dialogue on my campus, you know, and saying like, oh, wow, how do you manage that? Because the minute it plunks in the room, the minute it drops in, guess what people do? They get frozen. They're like, oh my God, did you guys hear that? Somebody quick, dash over it. Somebody gloss over it really quick. Say something else. It's more personal, like your own experience. Matt is struggling with grading in general, instructional design for this reason, maybe an inoculated grading technique. Oh my gosh. I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Does anybody want to pick up on that?
I can sort of expand a bit. Yeah, no, I wonder, because when you're sort of tasked with structuring the space and the time, it seems like there's a lot of responsibility in that. And then, you know, talking about that master narrative and grading and kind of what is, you know, the standard that is being set seems, you know, there's a lot of ethical responsibility, and there's a lot of history and culture and all of this bound up together. And going with that settler colonial sort of industrial capitalist, you know, name whatever adjective you want to that. But that's the power dynamic that is reproducing itself through how we grade, how we instruct and design, and all of the sort of unconscious infrastructure that allows for that space to be structured as it is. So it's always something to be critical about, right? Like, you know, is like Zoom in general, if everybody's moving there, or smart boards, or, you know, the industrial factories that are producing the pencils and smart, you know, Chromebooks, whatever. So it's all very, you know, suspect and entangled and you know, woven with these other things. Anyway, so that's kind of where my mind sort of goes. But yeah, happy to hear others.
Can I jump in for a second? Because
Yeah.
Matt raised something for me. I mean, I do consciously, in terms of instructional design, and I think this goes back to why I'm so committed at some level to having some banking elements. Excuse the puppy. Not sure what he's excited about. That there are just things that I can let the students do grade-wise that they don't feel like I'm evaluating them based on what they say in class. Even the experiential stuff is based on participation or completion of a self-assessment or something in that regard, so that they have space to not feel like the content of their stories is the thing I'm going to nitpick at. I don't think it's perfect, but like I can feel you and feel that I'm like, I purposely try to separate the grade and the stuff you do for the grade in some way from the conversational stuff that I really care about, but that they might not care as much about because they're students and they've been told to care about the grade.
Sure. No, and absolutely, and that's what it should be. But even then, it seems like, you know, what is it that you're going to sort of emphasize, and what is it that you're going to sort of help, and like the direction and the process and the end goal and all of that stuff. So, but yeah, no, that's absolutely great. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that is being pointed out is just how even the system or the way in which the spaces that we're talking about, whether it's the space of the conversation of, you know, migrants and how that gets framed within a particular set of systemic discursive practices versus the classroom, which also is embedded within layers of, you know, systemic discursive practices, and that it just highlights how much these this narrative of responsibility is happening within a particular context in which we're all navigating and we're all caught up in it, right? And I think that's something that I think is really just being highlighted here, even as we get into like the microcosm of the moment in the classroom versus talking about these really entrenched discourses happening at national level about migrants, and then what's happening, you know, how that's anchored into local processes for their lived experience in the caravans, right? So I don't know, I'm just seeing the ways in which this is paralleled. Yeah.